So what's interesting about this thematic approach is you're going to see similar or hear similar tenets about our evolving country throughout the lectures. And as I was working yesterday on the one for portraiture next week, I think that's the one where we're really going to see the definition of what we know of as traditional art movements, things that you see in the collection that really take us through. Still life's a little bit different. It's a little bit more challenging. In art history, we have what is known as the canon. And that is sort of the hierarchy of what is important in the minds of, say, Vasari, Vauquelin, early scholars in art history. And of course, those are biblical scenes, not even landscape painting, more historical scenes. And when you get down to the bottom of the list, that's where you have still life and genre painting. So we're going to attempt to kind of lift these up and make the case for these being as significant and important in the development of our nation in the ways that they reflect our values by the artists that were working during those times. So today we're going to start with a Dutch painting, which is here in the collection of the Columbia Museum of Art, just to kind of situate still life and define what it is for us, and then we'll move through the American pieces in the collection. So today we'll be examining American still lifes from the Columbia Museum of Art collection. To begin, we must trace the roots of still life painting back to the works of French and Dutch still life masters of the 17th and 18th centuries. We will then explore how late 18th and early 19th century American artists adapted European still life tradition to American taste, character, and experience. Through today's overview, we will see a range from the plain compositions of the nation's earliest still lives to the widely popular trompe l'oeil, or fool the eye, works of the Gilded Age, to the abstract, to the benign or mundane, to the hyper-realistic. Still life has occupied an ambivalent position in American art history. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, artists such as Raphael Peale, who we'll look at in a moment, used still life to demonstrate technical refinement and moral restraint, often emphasizing sobriety, order, and clarity. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, American still life absorbed European modernist influences as artists transformed objects into vehicles for abstraction, color, and rhythm, rather than illusionistic deception. By the middle of the 20th century, still life in America increasingly became a conceptual field. Jasper John's targets and flags displaced traditional objecthood while still engaging with the idea of everyday things. As we will see during our time together today, it is within this lineage where still life becomes less about representation and more about meaning. So what is still life? Still life is a genre that spans art history. It is found everywhere from ancient Egyptian tombs decorated with paintings of objects from everyday life to works of modern art where it provided opportunities to experiment with new techniques, forms, and styles. The term still life comes from the Dutch word still even, which was introduced in the mid-17th century to describe paintings of motionless objects from nature, such as flowers, fruit, game, or everyday items. The genre became particularly popular in the Netherlands during the 17th century when urbanization led to a greater emphasis on the home, personal possessions, and commerce. So why make a still life? The still life term describes a work of art that shows inanimate objects from the natural or man-made world, such as flowers, fruit, dead game, or vessels like baskets or bowls. Looked at another way, still lifes depict things that are still and don't move. So take a look at the painting on the screen. You'll see here that this still life is representative of this artist's oeuvre in that these same subjects and objects were painted over and over again throughout his career. He used these objects as the basis for experimentations with their shape, color, lighting, and placement. There are many possible reasons an artist may be inspired to create a still life. They may wish to play with perspective and the arrangements of objects in the picture plane, which is known as the composition, or highlight different techniques. Other times, a still life represents something significant about the artist, like a prolonged period of time spent indoors, or it could provide practical benefits, like eliminating the need to hire a model or travel to a landscape. Though it may appear simple, still life art can also portray complex themes. Some celebrate life and its pleasures by showing off food, wine, and material riches. But look carefully. There are signs of a human presence nearby. The wine glass is only half full, and the bread is torn, as though someone has just taken a piece and then vanished. Still life can also warn of the dangers or temporary nature of these pleasures. Memento mori, or in Latin, remember you must die, and vanitas pictures both tackle themes of death and fragility. Memento mori typically includes skulls, extinguished candles, and hourglasses, while vanitas also include other symbols of vanity like wine and musical instruments. Sometimes you will see rotting flowers or food, or notice a skull or an hourglass, reminding you that death is the ultimate end for us all. Memorializing religious messages about gluttony or greed could also be built into these tableaus. Still life captures light by manipulating, directing, and diffusing artificial or natural light sources to sculpt, define, and add dimension to or create a mood for these inanimate objects. Still lifes may be painted, drawn, photographed, or sculpted. You can create still life in any medium. Still life art has featured objects like fishing supplies, a tea set, a bouquet of flowers. As long as the subjects are inanimate, the work of art is still part of the still life genre. Inspiration for still lives can truly come from anywhere. And I show you this example now, flowers in a glass vase. There's a typo there, apologize for that. On a stone pedestal with a dragonfly. This is from the Louvre, and just to show us a companion or comparison piece to the previous slide. Here we see a beautiful, high-style, grand-style bouquet of flowers. This is also considered a vanitas still life because it, as I said, was created in the grand manner, but we see wilting flowers in the front. Things are starting to die off. It's very subtle. You have to look really closely. And this is an example of a painting that was given to King Louis XIV of France, which shows evidence of the artist's skill, his mastery, and his popularity and fame at the time of its painting. So we do see evidence of still lives, being appreciated as high art or fine art. As I mentioned, the painting, which is great in its variety of flowers and delicate brushwork, captures every detail of the hyperreal flowers, which seem to pop from the painting's surface. Even though there is no skull, hourglass, or obvious vanitas symbols, Mignon's still life has certain elements that evoke this painting genre. As I mentioned, some flowers bend, they begin to fade, lose some petals, etc., which remind the viewer of the vanity of worldly things and the brevity of life. Mignon also includes butterflies, which are a symbol of resurrection, and plants like wheat heads, referring to the Eucharistic Supper. Still life painting took root in America during the early 1800s. Previous to that time, still life as an art form was almost non-existent here. The earliest pre-19th century examples were often limited to illustrations, such as a beautifully rendered botanical study in publications, minor emblematic details in portraits, or interior decorations. Still life as independent subject would be considered frivolous by Puritans in colonial times. Furthermore, in European art academies, still life was considered the lowest of the genres after portraits, history, and landscape, which explains why still life painting led a, pardon the pun, wallflower or marginal existence for such a long time. Beginning in the early 1800s, American artists who studied abroad brought back European still life influences. However, they developed their own approach to still life painting by selecting objects that were typically American, and they adapted their style and composition to fit American taste. The first American still lifes were modest in scale and in subject, often focusing on products cultivated on American soil. While European artist Abraham Mignon painted in an opulent style and alluded to the vast international trade of the Dutch Republic in his floral bouquet full of exotic plants, American artists often used native plants to express national pride. Raphael Peale was a pioneering American still life painter, widely regarded as the first professional artist in the United States to focus primarily on still life. He is celebrated because his still lifes are meticulous in detail and realism, depicting everyday objects like fruits, cakes, glassware, and tableware. They are quiet, intimate compositions often set against dark, plain backgrounds. And he uses a subtle symbolism, hitting at themes like transience and mortality. Representative themes in his works include education and virtue, control over nature, proof of artistic refinement in a young nation, as his objects are carefully arranged and symbolically charged. We see in the image before us that Raphael Peale appropriated the traditional European format of the small tabletop still life to highlight humble, classic American products such as corn, yams, and cantaloupe, celebrating the fertile American soil. The fruit and vegetables Peale selected for his corn and cantaloupe grew in his birth state of Maryland. It was probably no coincidence that these were also the staple crops of the plantation belonging to the painter's first owner, Dr. Benjamin Lee from Maryland. The cantaloupe has been identified as an Anne Arundel melon, which only grew in certain parts of Maryland at the time. Peale was born in Anne Arundel County, so the fruit may have been an autobiographical reference, similar to the pea formed by the husk and silk of the corn. Sweet corn was considered, and some might still say it is distinctly an American crop. Still life with cake from 1818 is another restrained tabletop arrangement with cake, fruit, and vessels that exemplify Peale's delicate color palette and focused composition. He presents objects with crisp realism and sober excellence. Still life with cake is important because it quietly changed what Americans thought were worth painting and how. When Raphael Peale painted still life with cake, American artists were expected to do portraits, history, or patriotic subjects as well. Still life was considered trivial, but Peale basically said, nope, this is serious art, and he did it with total confidence. He legitimized still life and helped establish still life as an independent, respectable genre in the United States. The subject is modest, again, a slice of cake, fruit, a glass, a plain tabletop, but the composition is tightly controlled, it's calm and restrained, and it's almost eerily quiet. The absence of drama is the point here. The painting asks the viewer to slow down and look closely, something unusual in early American art. Peale's handling of the crumbly cake texture, the translucent glass, and the soft reflections and shadows were technically exceptional for the time. The objects feel present, not decorative. The level of realism aligned American art more closely with European traditions, especially Spanish and Dutch still life. There is a subtle symbolism, a vanitas, if you will, but American in style. What I mean to say is that nothing screams symbol or symbolic, yet everything sort of whispers it. Food equals pleasure, fragility, impermanence, stillness, as if time were suspended. It echoes Vanitas themes, but without the skulls or theatrics. It is very understated and very modern feeling. Unlike lush European still lifes, this one feels introspective and almost austere. The tone fits early American values of sobriety, self-control, private reflection, making it culturally revealing as well as visually important. In summation, still life with cake is important because it provided that ordinary objects could carry artistic weight, emotional depth, and intellectual seriousness, helping define a uniquely American approach to realism and still life. Now we're going to move on to something a little more shocking. Even though the Columbia Museum of Art does not own a work that I am aware of by John James Audubon, we cannot talk about still life in American art without including him. Audubon, who was born in 1785 and died in 1851, was a naturalist and an artist, best known for The Birds of America, which was a monumental 19th century work featuring 435 life-size hand-colored prints of North American birds. It was published in several installments between 1827 and 1838. And it is known for its stunning artistic quality and scientific detail, and is considered a masterpiece of both art and ornithology. Audubon endeavored to understand and categorize nature, art, and science. His Carolina parrot from 1828 approximately depicts a species now extinct and provides a single example of how the combined artistic and scientific ambition was what motivated his trying to capture and illustrate the birds of America. What we need to keep in mind is during Audubon's time, there was no wildlife photography. An accurate scientific illustration required a specimen that did not move. As an absolute perfectionist, he took what we may perceive as dramatic action. Audubon had a habit of painting animals he had killed, and that does sound a little bit jarring. He shot birds himself, other animals as well, and then he posed the birds using wires, pins, and strings to make them look alive, perched, flying, fighting, or feeding. He painted them very quickly before decay set in. The result is that his paintings are essentially dramatic still lives made from dead animals rather than from drawings made out in nature. In comparison to a classical still life, Audubon's animals appear intensely alive. His compositions are dramatic, indicating motion, aggression, and even predatory behavior. Again, they are a combination of scientific precision mixed with theatrical flair. In the 19th century, this was standard practice for naturalists. Today, however, it raises real ethical questions, especially since Audubon sometimes killed large numbers of birds to get a perfect pose. This tension is now part of how museums and scholars discuss his legacy. So how does Audubon compare with traditional still life paintings, such as Dutch hunting still lifes? And I'll just show you, I brought in a comparison. He was not the only one doing this. Again, if we just discussed Raphael Peale, Charles Wilson Peale had his own museum that was mostly natural history specimens that he collected, trying to document, say, like an herbarium or botanical gardens, every example of the animal that lived in his area. And you can see this is sort of early taxidermy as well, so that you really have the still object becoming inanimate so that it could be painted. In Dutch hunting still lifes of the 17th century, and you'll have to imagine, because I forgot to put in a comparison slide, my apologies, dead game are included, such as hares, pheasants, ducks, and partridges. The animals are unmistakably dead with limp bodies, glassy eyes, blood, and they often hang by their feet. They're arranged with guns, nets, bags, or trophies to indicate man's power over nature. Dutch still lifes are static, heavy, and gravity-bound. Emphasis is placed on the texture of the fur, feathers, metal, blood. Compositions feel paused, like time stopped. They are loaded with symbolism, with objects that suggest wealth and leisure time activities. There is an obvious human dominance over nature and a continuation of Vanitas themes of life, death, and decay. These paintings are meant to be read allegorically. Audubon, in turn, creates images from birds and animals that he personally kills, and so the bodies are posed to look alive, and as I mentioned before, participating in their native behaviors. They suggest extreme motion with wings spread, claws extended, and bodies twisted. Time feels like it stopped during the middle of an event rather than after it has finished. There are no weapons or hunters shown, but instead death is hidden. Audubon defended his actions by claiming scientific objectivity. Like the Dutch, he is also asserting human mastery over nature, but he justifies the paradox of killing as necessary to preserve knowledge. For him, beauty comes out of and depends on destruction, even if it compromises his personal ethics. The key contrast here is that Dutch painters acknowledge death, and Audubon erases it visually. Dutch hunting still lifes confront the viewer with death as consequence. Audubon distinguishes death as vitality. Turning the still life into a scientific illusion of life. It reminds us again, remember, you must die, the memento mori theme. Whereas in Audubon's work, he is instead saying, look how alive this world is. And we see this, you know, these birds, I mean, it almost looks like a photograph, the birds in their natural habitat. You can almost hear them as they're making their sounds. Now, moving on to something different, we're going to look at this example by William Michael Harnett, Still Life, Violin, and Music from 1888. And this is an example of a trompe-l'oeil painting or a fool the eye painting. This was a group of still lifes that became very popular in America during the late 19th century. They were very illusionistic, and they gave the appearance of the three-dimensionality of the objects. These paintings were intimate, everyday objects with more of that extreme realism. Subjects featured clothing, letters, currency, tools, musical instruments, and so on. Themes included reality versus illusion, time, use, and decay, and American nostalgia. Hartnett is really the key person to paint in this fool the eye style in the United States. He was born in 1848 in Ireland and immigrated to the US, where he lived until 1892. Things I want you to pay attention to here, we see keys, violins, letters, tankards, a variety of different things, books, pipes, and they're painted so precisely that people reportedly tried to pick them up. You feel like you could grab these objects off of the canvas. He is known for elevating ordinary things to serious art, much in the same way that Raphael Peale did, which was pretty radical, again, in the 19th century in America. His compositions are carefully constructed. Objects often hang on wooden doors or boards, arranged with delicate balance and quiet drama. And many of his works play with this idea of time, memory, and absence. We see things may be faded, a little worn, you know, they're not new and shiny like they've just come off the shelf. This is one of his most sophisticated works. He is known for several others, but here we see the violin, the sheet music, the related small objects arranged against a plain surface. There's nothing flashy about it. There's no dramatic lighting. It's just intense realism, again, wanting to be able to pick up those objects. We also want to keep in mind what is missing here. There's no musician, right? It's just the instrument and the music that's left behind. And that adds to this level of quietness that we see in still lifes, and really asking us to look closely and think about what has come, what has gone, what has come before. So what is the larger meaning in this particular painting? How would this work, or is this work, interpreted? I suggest 3 interpretations: music as memory, time and use, and art versus reality. So let's break this down. Music as memory, meaning the violin and score suggest sound, but the painting itself is silent. That contrast gives the work a reflective, almost melancholic mood. Time and use, unlike pristine luxury objects that we've seen in Dutch still lifes, Harnet's violin feels lived in. It hints a human presence without the person showing, but it clearly was an important object that was used. Art versus reality, the painting is a visual trick, but it's also a meditation on perception and how easily we trust what we see. Now, hopefully, one of these paintings, the version on your left is in the Columbia Museum of Art collection, and the other I brought as a comparison just because we see an artist here, like the Dutch, using the same materials over and over and over again, and they're just so similar. The pleasures of the senses and sensuality became the primary focus of American still life painters at the beginning of the Victorian era. These were typically created for parlors or dining rooms. The works of this period exemplify a spirit of newfound prosperity and abundance, as can be seen in Severin Rosen's vivid floral still lifes in tables overflowing with nature's bounty. Here, his focus is on prosperity and comfort. We see large displays of food, flowers, and sometimes game. These are associated with middle-class domestic ideals as our country is growing and emerging. We see representative themes of wealth and plenty, but still that control of nature and really celebrating everyday life and objects for a middle-class person or family. Rosen's still life celebrates an American harvest and the promise of more to come. 19th century improvements in cultivation and shipping practices enabled that extravagant assortment, which includes a tropical pineapple and heavily seeded melons, to allude to the nation's future bounty. More specifically, the split pomegranate and half-eaten melon carried the seeds of next year's planting. The glass of champagne invites a quiet moment of appreciation. A German immigrant, Rosen fled the revolutions of 1848 for the promises of America. He trained as a china and enamel painter in his native Germany. He exhibited in New York in the 1850s, sending 11 paintings to the American Art Union's free gallery exhibitions between 1848 and 1852. In 1863, he settled in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Located in the north-central part of the state, Williamsport was a wealthy city in 19th century America because of its abundance of lumber. Around the middle of the century, the city boasted more millionaires per capita than any other locale, making it a lucrative market for an enterprising artist. Rosen's patrons included lumber industry moguls who relished the perceived limitlessness of American resources. He cultivated a popular following in the German community in Pennsylvania. So as I mentioned, both paintings on the screen are so very similar, as are most of Rosen's paintings, because he excelled in creating a visual opulence that his patrons expected. He revisited imagery and techniques that made him a success in his adopted country. The warm tones and profusion of meticulously rendered fruits spilling forth from wicker baskets recall the grand still life traditions of 17th century Dutch painting, a genre always popular with collectors both in Europe and America. But while such paintings often contain symbolic messages of warning and of the transience of life, Rosen's updated composition is a richly detailed celebration of the bounty and variety of nature. The two-tier arrangement appears in several of his other paintings. While it's large scale, this is over 3 feet in length, so think we've gone from the intimate Raphael peels to the much more large and opulent. It lends itself to the grand interiors of the luxurious homes being built in the prosperous city. The next work is by Guy Rose, who was an Impressionist painter. He was born in California, and he sort of did something of the opposite by becoming the first Californian to achieve acclaim on an international stage. Rose's loose brushstrokes and vibrant palette make for beautiful landscapes of coastlines, lavish depictions of domestic upper-class life, which was characteristic of many of the early painters in California. He was thought to be atypical for his region, and let's now explore why. Baby Guy was born in San Gabriel, California in 1867 as the 7th child of Leonard John Rose, a state senator and a pioneer. His mother, Amanda Jones Rose. Rose was blessed with a childhood in which he should have wanted for nothing. The entire city of Rosemead takes its namesake from the family title. All the same, his childhood was far from perfect, including a particularly unfortunate hunting incident in which Rose was shot in the face by his brother. The only upside to the resulting convalescence was that it offered an opportunity for Rose to learn how to sketch and paint, which may point to this as the moment he became interested in the arts. Following high school, Rose moved to San Francisco and attended the California School of Design. He later enrolled at the Académie Julienne in Paris. It was during Rose's time in Paris that he met his wife, Ethel Boardman, while studying together. In 1895, they married. She herself was an artist of some repute, with illustrations appearing in Vogue and other magazines. Up until the turn of the century, the Roses traveled back and forth between France and New York City, where Mr. Rose painted and taught. In 1899, however, they returned to France and purchased a cottage in the town of Giverny, the art colony where French Impressionist Claude Monet painted for much of his life. The pair spent most of their time living there until 1912. Here, Rose became one of the few American protégés and friends of Claude Monet. Rose's association with Monet and other artists working in Giverny influenced his use of color, light, and painterly touch, making his style the most French of the California Impressionists. At the turn of the century, lead poisoning required Rose to give up oil painting. He turned to illustration and worked with his wife, Ethel. Working from their cottage in Giverny, the couple became, quote, the best living fashion artists, end quote, in the world. They returned to the United States in 1912, and 2 years later settled in Alhambra in Southern California. From there, he traveled to picturesque locales and coastal communities like Laguna Beach, and ultimately Carmel by the Sea, to paint plein air scenes that captured California's crystalline light, atmosphere, trees, and foliage. Charles Ethan Porter, who dates from 1885 to 1890, was working on the opposite side of the country around the same time as Rose. He's often left out of the history books. Many scholars, however, have taken an interest in him and his work over the last decade. Porter was a contemporary of sculptor Edmonia Lewis and painters Robert Selden Duncanson, who we discussed last week, as well as Edward Mitchell Bannister. Some have argued that Porter is forgotten or has been forgotten in part, because of his focus on still lifes. Porter is the first known professional Black artist to focus on still lifes in the United States, although older paintings like Duncanson did paint some. Featuring floral arrangements and fruit, Porter's works built on earlier American still life paintings. Porter was born in Hartford, Connecticut, and raised in nearby Rockville. After taking drawing lessons as a child and studying painting in high school, Porter was accepted into the National Academy of Design in 1869. He is believed to be the first Black student to attend the premier art school. Porter studied there through 1873, starting with drawing from casts of ancient Greek and Roman sculptures and rising to painting live models. While attending the Academy, Porter had the opportunity to exhibit his work there. It was one of the best ways to make a name for himself in the 19th century art world. While his paintings received attention in the New York Times, Porter still had to teach art on the side to support his studies. He returned to Hartford in 1877 to start a studio there. While still life paintings were too traditional for New York collectors, Hartford critics and collectors admired them. The level of detail of his studies of insects and birds stunned the Connecticut crowd. Porter joined a line of Black artists who found success in Hartford, including photographer Augustus Washington. But even in the liberal-minded city, early news reports of Porter's work often qualified him as, quote, the colored painter, end quote. Eventually, he would just be known by his name or known as, quote, the Hartford artist, end quote. In 1881, Porter decided to travel abroad to continue his development as an artist. He auctioned nearly 100 paintings in his studio and raised $1,800. He hoped the money would be enough to support him for a couple of years. Porter arrived in Paris with letters of introduction from illustrious Hartford citizens, including one of the most famous American writers of the time, Samuel Clemens, who wrote under the pen name Mark Twain. We don't know much about Porter's time in France, but he is believed to have attended the École Nationale Supérieure des Arts Décoratifs, excuse my Southern French. Art historians think he may have studied the works of Henri Fontaine-Latour, at the time the best-known still-life painter in France, and his predecessor, Jean Chardin. Porter's time in France clearly inspired a change in his style. One Hartford reviewer wrote that following his return to the United States, his, quote, dainty, almost finicky work we're so familiar with has been superseded by a broader, freer style. Let's try that again. His dainty, almost finicky work we're so familiar with has been superseded by a broader, freer style, end quote. He would have painted this particular still life upon his return to the United States after his style had changed. So a little bit freer, as we said, more painterly. Less than 2 years into his time in France, Porter's money ran out. He wrote to Mark Twain asking him for help. His letters to the writer are the only known first-person accounts we have from Porter. On April 4th, 1883, he wrote, quote, now I am aware that there are a goodly number of my Hartford friends and others who are anxious to see how the colored artist will make out, but this is not the motive which impresses me. There is something of more importance. The colored people, my people, as a race, I am interested in, and my success will only add to others who have already shown wherein they are capable the same as other men, end quote. Conscious of his place in an art world dominated by white men, Porter was eager to show that he and other artists could do work too. As we move into the 20th century, we take a little bit of a jump here and look at the work of Josephine Sibley Cooper's Jugs from 1930. Despite the ravages of the American Civil War, the Sibley family of Augusta, Georgia, retained their fortune. Therefore, like Rose, Josephine had a comfortable childhood. Her early passion for art was nurtured by a trip abroad at the age of 12, and when she returned, her father hired an instructor and equipped a studio for her use. While supportive of his daughter's talent, Father Sibley hoped these provisions would keep her safely ensconced at home. That paternal control, however, went with him to the grave in 1888. The very next year, Josephine Sibley enrolled at the Arts Student League, funded by the sale of some property that had been left to her. At the League, William Merritt Chase was her mentor, although she took the standard classes in drawing antique casts from other instructors. The boldness that had impelled the young artist to New York City was often at odds with deeply ingrained Southern motives. When a necessary League course in composition was scheduled for 7 o'clock in the evening, Sibley refused to attend on the grounds that no lady could be out on the streets unescorted at night. In 1890, Sibley made a second grand tour of Europe where she sketched genre scenes and copied old master paintings. The following year, she returned home and married a widower, 16 years her senior. For women artists, marriage raised certain issues. Balancing household and child-rearing responsibilities with the desire to be creative was a daily challenge. Developing a professional identity in the public arena was complicated, too. In the South, these dilemmas were aggravated by traditional conservative values. Like her father, Cooper's husband encouraged his wife's creativity and constructed a studio as an integral part of their residence, not as an addition. During their 14-year marriage, Cooper was a dutiful wife and mother of 2 children, and primarily painted likenesses of family members and friends. Over her long career, she is frequently listed in exhibition brochures as Mrs. B. King Cooper, although she regularly and serendipitously signed her work J.S. Cooper, which did not divulge her gender. Once her children came of age, Cooper broadened her subject matter as well as her style. She studied under Elliot Dangerfield in Blowing Rock, North Carolina, and spent several summers in Massachusetts, where her instructor was Hugh Breckinridge. From 1920 to 1930, at the age of 62, Cooper spent time abroad, living in Paris, and taking classes under the French Cubist, André Lotte, probably at the suggestion of her distant cousin and fellow artist, Margaret Law, who had studied with him earlier. Cooper attempted some abstracted paintings, but did not embrace the style wholeheartedly. Most of her career, she pursued a conventional form of realism, and by the 1920s, the influence of Impressionism became more evident. Given her financial security, Cooper never felt compelled to sell her work, even though she exhibited widely with such entities as the Southern States Art League, the National Association of Women Artists, and in Paris at the 1930 Salon d'Automne. In 1927, the High Museum of Art hosted a solo exhibition in her honor. When Cooper happened to make a sale, she donated the proceeds after expenses to her church or to missions in Africa. So we see here there's not a lot about this particular work, but I think her biography is important. And next week, we're going to delve into other female artists who studied under William Merritt Chase to make the comparison, Anna Haywood Taylor being one of them, who studied under William Merritt Chase, who painted the Taylor portraits here at the Columbia Museum of Art. But as a single woman, we see that she had a very different life and an opportunity to really be an artist on her own terms, if you will. This work is by Luigi Lucioni, and talking a little bit, I will start with his biography as well. His biography has overtones of a classic immigrant's tale. His parents came to this country from a small Italian town near the Swiss border in 1911. They settled in Union City, New Jersey, where his father took up his trade as a cooper. After several years of school, Lucioni worked in an engraving house and then continued the art lessons he had begun in Italy. He studied in succession at Cooper Union, at the National Academy of Design, and at the Tiffany Foundation in Oyster Bay, Long Island. At the last, now well-known artists John Sloan, Kenneth Hayes Miller, Gifford Beale, and Child Hassam taught classes. Success soon followed with the show in galleries, and he was the recipient of several medals, as well as the sale of a still life painting to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The sale, in turn, led Lucioni to travel to Vermont, where he was hired for a commission from Mrs. J. Watson Webb, co-founder of the Shelburne Museum of Art. Rural Vermont reminded Lucioni of northern Italy, but by then the two had perhaps become conflated in Lucioni's mind in a more meaningful way. The hills of Vermont struck a home chord because they also signified certain American values that were important to him. The act of painting rural Vermont, therefore, became a way of reinforcing those values and not incidentally of marking his achievement in this country. In 1939, Lucioni bought a farmhouse and a barn near Manchester Depot. The latter he turned into a studio where he continued to paint and make etchings of the surrounding countryside for the next 50 years. So let's talk about this painting. This dog just really, I love this dog. For some people, realism is defined by painting what they see. For Lucioni, realism was not defined by what he saw, but rather his version of realism was an imagined realism. He painted what he thought was there. He painted a reflection of his own perception of reality that often appeared more vibrant than life itself. Though his still lifes do appear to represent objects as they appear in life, there are a host of elements that keep them separate from direct representations of reality. Firstly, Lucioni's use of color, while muted to an extent, appears almost unburdened by shadow. Certainly, the light he depicts is directional, but it doesn't distract from the vibrancy of the objects. Here, the brushstrokes for the dog-shaped vase are more evident and textural than the pristinely crisp wallpaper. He is demonstrating his mastery of a variety of different painting techniques in this way. Lucioni said this of his still lifes, quote, "Once I have set them down, my intent is to make them look as absolutely alive as possible," end quote. Here, then, he is possibly subverting the Vanitas message of a still life. Instead of being about death, we see a man and woman depicted on the wallpaper to the right of the window. It's very hard to see them. Over here, right? If we explore the iconographic meaning of the flowers depicted, we know that pink Gerber daisies mean tenderness, affection, and admiration. Orange Gerbers stand for energy, warmth, and vitality. So I wonder, could Lucioni have painted the interior of the young couple who are in love and beginning their life together? So really not about death, but about new beginnings. I'm so embarrassed. This image, this quality is horrible. So I brought a companion piece with it, so you could get an idea of his work. I didn't get with Wilson with the snow to get a better image, so I do apologize. Breakfast table on the left is the work in the Columbia Museum of Art, and Studio Corner, a later work from a New York gallery. Lionel Gilbert was born in Newark, New Jersey in 1912. He began his artistic training very early in the Saturday Children's Program of the Newark School of Fine and Industrial Art in 1924. In 1933, he graduated from the same school and moved to France for 5 years, where he studied both privately and at the Académie de la Grande Chaume. Again, apologies. I actually took French. Upon his return to the United States, he became part of the Chicago's Works Progress Administration program, creating large murals in many public buildings. For many of the following years, he worked as an illustrator in places such as Cleveland and New York City. During the war, he was sent to England as an official artist with the United States Air Force to depict various aspects of Air Force life in and around Air Force bases. In the 1960s, Gilbert's direction shifted. He was no longer interested in using paint to tell stories. He began to explore what the paint itself was about. He was interested in its materiality and color and what that could reveal in its own independent and descriptive capacity. The painting here on the screen calls to mind Henri Matisse, George Braque, and Ferdinand Léger and their Cubist sensibility and handling of space. He showed his work at the Alonzo Gallery in New York City through the early 1980s, and he taught at the 92nd Street YMCA from 1867 to 2002, the year he passed away. Former CMA curator Will South described Gilbert's painting in a news article in 2012 as this, quote, "As the 20th century moved on, art movements of all kinds emerged, often known as isms. Cubism, Fauvism, Surrealism, and abstract expressionism among them. Lionel Gilbert's sensually compelling breakfast table is a prime example of how an artist fuses stylistic sources. Here, visitors see glimmers of cubism in the faceted planes that make up the compote and cups, while the bold and paint-laden brush of abstract expressionism is present too. Touches of arbitrary color speak to the influence of Fauvism. While Gilbert's painting is a visual delight, it is also an object lesson on how artists think. Good results often come from blending of influences that came before us," end quote. And you really see the flattening of the space that comes about with early modernism and those influences coming over from Europe. Now here is a work by the artist Ben Zion. Ben Zion, also known as Ben Zion Weinman, was born in Ukraine in 1897. After the death of his father, a cantor and composer of liturgical music, Ben Zion's mother moved him and his younger siblings to Boston in 1920. 6 months later, Ben Zion moved to the Bronx, New York, where he met Hebrew and Yiddish writers, with whom he published a Hebrew-Yiddish journal. He was an American painter, printmaker, sculptor, educator, and poet. Ben Zion often mined biblical and other Jewish subject matter in his art. Quote, Ben Zion was among the first to create works in America in response to the Holocaust and its effects on the continuation of Eastern Europe culture in America. He was among the very few artists through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s to create works based on the Hebrew Bible at a time when many Jewish artists avoided stressing their Jewish heritage. His choice of subject matter did not find a ready audience for many Jews who sought assimilation into mainstream American culture and who were unfamiliar with biblical history, end quote. And that was a quote from Matthew Bigel, who was art history professor emeritus at Rutgers University. What makes Zion interesting to me is several things. And here we see an artist who is representative of a lot of political action at the mid-century. Ben Zion was a founding member of the 10 group of expressionist artists, along with Arthur Gottlieb and Mark Rothko. The 10 was also known as the 10 Whitney Dissenters, meaning the Whitney Museum of American Art. They were a group of New York-based artists active from 1935 to 1940. Expressionist in tendency, the group was founded to gain exposure for its members during the economic difficulty of the Great Depression, and also in response to the popularity of regionalism, which dominated the gallery space its members sought. The group's 9 shows were held at galleries and locations around New York City, including one international exhibition in Paris. Work exhibited by the 10 included figurative art. However, some of its artists' members later rose to prominence as abstract artists, for example, Mark Rothko. The 10 were among several artists groups active in the 1930s in New York, which had left-wing or communist affiliation. The Artists' Union formed in February 1934, and its activities helped precipitate the Works Progress Administration Federal Art Project. During the same period, the American Artists Congress formed in 1935, having ties to the American Communist Party. All of the founding members of the 10 were members of both groups. Ben Zion's work has been classified as social realism, and it's often compared to Ben Shahn. Now, he did do several examples of the still life of chrysanthemums, but again, his range, he painted everything. Biblical scenes, still lives, landscapes, you name it. And he is of interest to me because he was a part of a group of artists that were maligned by the federal government. So if you will allow me to indulge you with my dissertation knowledge, let's take a look at this as a sidebar. So what you see here are two examples of publications. On the left side is Look magazine, and on the right side is a newspaper. And basically what they have done is, at the time in the 1940s, the United States was still trying to assert itself with its own American artistic identity, right? Until abstract expressionism, we were always looking at European influences. We didn't have our own defined style. We tried with portraiture, we tried with landscape painting, such as the Hudson River School painters or Bierstadt's paintings of the West, but to no avail, no success. We just didn't have a signature art form. So in the 1940s, the United States State Department decided to put on an exhibition of the best American artists, the most important working artists at the time. It was curated by a single person, and that was a problem. And this entire Leroy Davidson sent all of these paintings to UNESCO in Paris for an exhibition. Well, they were well received, mostly made by immigrants, mostly made by people who had communist leanings in the 20s and 30s, and the United States State Department, because of yellow journalists publishing these paintings, were embarrassed. They did not see social realism. They did not see depictions of humans, as you see them here on the screen, as representative of America's finest art or our native culture. And so the State Department recalled the exhibition, canceled it, and sold all of these paintings at a 95% discount as war surplus. And so where I entered this conversation was I looked at university museums and their foundings of their art collections. And several universities bought the majority of these paintings for their collections and then hired the artists as visiting instructors to be able to help promote their work, as well as give them a job and to rewrite history. And so you see here some pretty famous folks. The picture of the boy in the red shirt, that is a Ben Shahn. That was used on poverty posters, during the Great Depression and after. My favorite, of course, is the Yasu Kuniyoshi of the circus girl here, who is slightly undressed. That was in the collection at Auburn University. And then, of course, the stories abound, right? She supposedly was hung in the student union, stolen from the storage space, hung in the student union for a while to be teased before Auburn finally built the Julie Museum in the 2000s. So it was much more about the artist's political beliefs as we are leading up to the McCarthy era and the Un-American Activities Act than it was even considering their artistic abilities, right? So we see things We may see Ben Zion's work as somewhat crude, right? It reminds me of Dubuffet, a French artist who was the father of naive, and I use that term in quotes because I see it as derogatory. But his work is important in its own right, and especially to now the Jewish population for his ability to assert those narratives at a time when they weren't popular. So thank you for indulging me on that little side trip. Now we're jumping ahead to the 1970s. This is the work by John Heileker, Still Life with Picture. Heileker was born in Yonkers, New York in 1909, and he was the grandson of a stonemason and a builder. He left high school in 1923 at the age of 15 to pursue art. He studied at the Art Students League in New York City from 1927 to 1929 under the tutelage of famous regionalist painter Thomas Hart Benton and Boardman Robinson. And this is really interesting. We'll see next week and in the following week when we look at genre paintings, you know, regionalism was safe. It was the 1930s, 1940s art form. And Thomas Hart Benton painted murals, you know, Works Progress Administration murals, murals in Capitol buildings in the Midwest. Yet he was very much a figural painter, a genre scene painter, but he taught Heileker, he taught, now his name is escaping me, Jackson Pollock. And so you see artists who embrace and create their own abstract styles, even though they have been trained in the most very realistic and representational examples by Benton and others. Heileker was given his first solo exhibition at the Maynard Walker Gallery in 1936, and several more followed. As was the case with most artists in the 1930s, he worked for the easel division of the Works Progress Administration's Federal Art Project, and he also made drawings for the New Masses Journal, which was a Marxist magazine closely associated with the Communist Party, or Communist Party USA, I should say. After the Maynard Walker Gallery closed in 1941, Heileker joined Kraschauer Galleries and exhibited there for more than 50 years. He played a critical role in the artistic and cultural life in New York City for more than 6 decades. He was given a retrospective at the Whitney Museum of American Art in 1968. He taught at Columbia University for 27 years and was among the founding faculty of the New York Studio School of Painting and Sculpture. He later joined the MFA painting program at the Parsons School of Design. In 1958, Heileker purchased an old sea captain's house in Great Cranberry Island in Maine, and he spent his summers there with his partner, Robert Lotan. The compound is now home to the Heileker Lotan Foundation, and a residency program for artists has been established there. Heileker was an adept draftsman and accomplished painter who developed a highly personal and expressive approach drawn during the Works Progress Administration years. His early drawings and sketches are comparable to those of his contemporaries, including Ben Shahn and Philip Evergood. Heileker shared their political activism. During World War II and the post-war years, he also received critical acclaim for his bold experimentation with biomorphic and gestural abstraction. By the 1950s, he had shifted to more representational subject matter, like we see here, often depicting everyday scenes with great poignancy. As his career progressed, his palette became more muted, and he adopted a nuanced impressionistic style in response to abstract expressionism. So as we move into the 1960s and 1970s, we've passed abstract expressionism, and now we're looking at everyday products as still lifes, as sculpture, as paintings, as high art, as portraits. We think of Andy Warhol's Coke bottles as well as his soup cans. Wayne Thiebaud, of course, making these delicious paintings of cakes and confections. And as we mentioned, Jasper Johns and his flags and other familiar symbols. So this art is about consumerism, it's about art as commodity, it's about banality and excess. And so I have for you here Roy Lichtenstein's Still Life with Lemon and Glass, or Untitled, from 1974. This piece comes from the period when Lichtenstein turned away from comic strip imagery and began reworking traditional art historical genres, especially still life. Even though the subject is classic, a lemon in a glass, he treats it with his signature pop art language of using bold black outlines and flat, simplified forms. He incorporates Ben-Day dots, which he borrowed from commercial printing. So what are these Ben-Day dots anyway? Ben-Day dots were developed by Benjamin Henry Day in 1879. They were created as an economical way to add color and tonal range to images in newspapers and comic books, enabling more intricate visuals on inexpensive paper. Unlike halftone dots, which vary in size, classic Ben-Day dots generally maintain a uniform size and distribution, achieving shading through density and spacing. Lichtenstein chose to use Ben-Day dots because he intentionally wanted his work to have a mechanical, impersonal look. His goal was to challenge the idea of the artistic hand and to create a playful tension between fine art traditions and mass-produced imagery. What is clever here is the contradiction. Still life is historically about careful observation and painterly skill, while Lichtenstein's version feels almost industrial and ironic. He is basically asking whether something becomes art because of how it's made, what it depicts, or who makes it. The print can be productively read as both a continuation of and a sharp commentary on the still life tradition and American art. By placing an ordinary tabletop arrangement at the center of his pop art vocabulary, Lichtenstein uses a historically quiet genre to interrogate perception, reproduction, and the legitimacy of modernism in the United States. In Still Life with Lemon and Glass, Untitled, Lichtenstein depicts a pared-down arrangement, right? We've got the lemon, the glass, the tabletop, all very flat, bold contours, and those Ben-Day dots. On the surface, the subject recalls the long history of still life, from Dutch banquet scenes to Cézanne's apples, but Lichtenstein strips the genre of sensuality, texture, and depth. The objects feel standardized. This move aligns with pop art's broader critique of originality and authorship. Unlike traditional still lives that celebrate the artist's hand and eye, Lichtenstein's image mimics mechanical reproduction. The lemon is not juicy or tactile. It is a sign of a lemon, a signifier. It's filtered through commercial printing aesthetics. In this sense, the work reflects post-war American culture saturated with advertising and mediated imagery. Importantly, Lichtenstein's still lives are not only about popular culture, but they also engage directly with European modernism, especially the work of Picasso, Braque, and Matisse, whose still lives deconstructed space and form. Lichtenstein's simplified planes and hard edges echo Cubist fragmentation, but his irony is distinctly American. Where Cubists sought to reinvent perception, Lichtenstein highlights how perception has already been shaped by mass media. Thus, the work functions as a double quotation. It references the still life tradition and modernist abstraction, while simultaneously flattening both into a graphic, reproducible image. This reflects the late 20th century American skepticism toward heroic artistic innovation. So within the history of American still life with lemon and glass represents a shift from immediacy to distance. Traditional American still lifes often imply presence, right? As we started, someone who has just left the table, where the fruit might be about to spoil. But here, by contrast, this feels frozen and impersonal. Time, decay, and touch, the classic themes of still life, are replaced by surface, sign, and style. Lichtenstein's 1974 still life demonstrates how a historically modest genre can be repurposed to address large cultural questions. In the context of American art history, the work marks a moment when still life becomes a site of critical reflection rather than an observation. Less about objects themselves and more about how Americans see, consume, and reproduce images. And for comparison, another pop artwork or another pop artist who's also really takes still life to all new levels with his everyday objects, larger than life sculptures, such as in Minnesota, we have the Spoon Bridge with the cherry on the end of the spoon and so on. So I submit here Three Hats by Claes Oldenburg from 1974, and want to quote the artist himself. Quote, "I am for an art that takes its form from the lines of life itself," end quote. Oldenburg wrote in his manifesto on art in 1961, setting the strategy for a multimedia practice that includes performance, drawing, painting, printmaking, and most famously, sculptures of quotidian objects. In all cases, Oldenburg aims to elevate the divide between the rarefied and the everyday object, between the environment and the life of the street. To this end, his work imbues inanimate objects with an expressive physicality and energy. This quality can be seen in Three Hats, in which a bowler hat is animated through its sequential reappearance as if it's moving down the street of its own accord. And we're getting to the end. We have now Janet Fish's Diane's Vase from 1988. Here we are in the hyper reel. Janet Fish is an American painter best known for her large-scale luminous still lifes that sit at the crossroads of photorealism and painterly abstraction. Fish was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1938. She passed away in December of last year, December 11th, 2025. She emerged in the 1970s on the New York art scene and taught for many years at Hunter College in New York City. Like her contemporary Audrey Flack, Fish isn't interested in copying reality perfectly. Instead, she focuses on light and refraction, especially through glass and water. Her use of color is intense, sometimes heightened or exaggerated. Sorry about that. There we go. Her paintings cause the eye to move because there is so much to take in. She excels at manipulating paint to create complex reflections and distortions. Up close, her paintings feel loose and energetic, but from afar, they snap into realism. That tension is her signature, trying to convey and communicate that tension. Janet Fish helped expand the style of photorealism, proving it didn't have to be cold or mechanical. Her work is sensual, playful, and deeply painterly, more about seeing than photographing. So what is photorealism? Photorealism emerged in the late 1960s and 1970s, mainly in the United States. Artists used photographs as source material and translated them into highly detailed, often large-scale artworks. It is an art movement where paintings and sometimes drawings are made to look as detailed and precise as photographs. But that surface realism is only half the story. So at first glance, you might ask, why paint this when the studio photograph already exists? But that question is exactly part of the point that Fish is trying to make. Photorealist works usually have extreme detail and sharp focus, smooth surfaces with minimal visual brushstrokes, and photographic effects like reflections, glare, depth of field, and cropping. Everyday subjects are featured, but the subjects draw from popular culture and current times. For example, we see cars, storefronts, diners, street scenes, and still lifes featured. Unlike the Vanitas or Memento Mori paintings of the past, here this is a feeling of neutrality or objectivity with no emotional drama. Artists like Fish use tools like projectors, grids, and airbrushes to transfer photographic information accurately. So photorealism isn't about realism from life, it's about realism mediated by a camera. That means reflections look camera true, not eye true. Distortions are kept and not corrected. And the painting imitates how a photo sees, not how a human sees. Photorealism is basically realism once removed, if you will. It pushed back against the emotional intensity of abstract expressionism, and it countered the idea that painting had to show visible brushwork to be authentic. So again, the big questions are, is painting still relevant in the age of photography? What does it mean to see something versus record it? And can a painting be both mechanical and expressive? Photorealism is less about showing off technical skill and more about examining reality through reproduction, technology, and perception. And our last work for today, in brief, is Betty Saar's The Long Memory from 1988. And here I see this, I interpret this as a still life. And called The Long Memory, it points to centuries of Black misrepresentation and mischaracterization. It pictures what looks like a shadow box, even though it is a flat print, containing a black left hand and a jeweled pendant with an open eye. The image is full of symbols, some tied to African American or African culture and rituals. Others hold Christian references, and still others linked to non-Western mythology. Together, they bridge different groups of people and time periods and trigger a variety of associations. Saar reminds us that we individuals, cultures, nations, histories are made up of layers. Her simple objects are visual indicators of the complexity of race, society, and customs, and simultaneously indicators of our own personal knowledge and biases. So I hope that what we've achieved today is to recognize that still life is an important art form in its own right. It has existed since the beginning art production was made. It can be a meditative study of a single small object, but really it can also serve as a metaphor for current events, and a metaphor for universality, and a metaphor of the world. So, thank you very much.